What Russians think about Vladimir Putin and his war matters. A few days ago, I asked a man who knows about the Kremlin's killing machine better than most. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, holds a press conference. But he's target one for Russian missiles, so the presser takes place deep underground in a tube station. It's pretty cool.
John Sweeney from the Taking on Putin podcast. We've all seen and admired Ukraine's heroic fight against what we've just got to call Russian fascism. But President Zelensky, what's your message to the Russian opposition, to the teenagers who go and make demonstrations and get beaten up by the Russian police in Moscow, by the man who took a copy of War and Peace and stood by the Kyiv monument in Red Square, and to Alexei Navalny? What's your message to the good people of Russia who are trying to oppose Vladimir Putin?
Thank you. It's difficult to send signals to those people who are opposed to the war. Not many Russians are going out onto the street to protest, but those who do are setting an example, building up the strength to break the information bubble. So I thank them. Words have power. Words are as powerful as bombs. That's why they are behind bars. A country with nuclear weapons is afraid of its own people.
And Russia is killing its neighbours.
This is Borodanka. Look at this block of flats behind me. War crime after war crime after war crime.
The block of flats I'm talking about was hit by a Russian bomb early on in the war. You can see what it looks like on my Twitter feed. Find me at John Sweeney Raw. I'm in Borodyanka, about 40 miles northwest of Kyiv. The bomb smashed a giant hole in the flats, but somehow the concrete held at the top of the building, so it looks like a polo mint.
So the Russian missile came this way and it's blown a whole bunch of paperwork to where I am now. Yulia Papai has won the first prize for a speaking English contest. And this is what's left of it.
Some of the flats were not hit by bombs, so the Russian army went looting.
This is evidence of looting. Handbag, jewellery box. Home sweet home.
On the floor of the kitchen is a white towel. On it, a Russian soldier has had a shit. When the Russian army retreated from Kyiv, the authorities started looking for the dead. They found 46 bodies just here so far, and the number keeps on going up. The killings are unimaginable but undeniable, and they happened in March 22 here in Ukraine. But we're going to start with some more bombings, which were unimaginable but deniable, and they were denied. We have to go back in time to Vladimir Putin's first days in power in the Kremlin. And we're doing this to understand the role that fear of death, by poison, by being shot, by being blown up in your own home in the middle of the night, plays in the minds of ordinary Russians, at home and abroad. You're listening to Taking on Putin, Episode 5. Let's not count the dead. It's September 99, and there are a series of apartment bombs in Moscow and across Russia, killing 300 people. Vladimir Putin, at this point still only prime minister but running for president, blames Chechen terrorists, launches a war, and his popularity soars. The Chechens are a mountain people, Muslim, and most are not at all keen on being part of a Russian empire. In episode 2, the poisonings begin. You heard from a Russian journalist who used to work in Moscow. Let's call her Veronica. Does she believe the Kremlin take on the Moscow apartment bombs, that Chechen terrorists were to blame?
Such difficult questions you ask me. I have a friend of mine whose family died in bombings in Moscow. He was just a young boy at the time and his family died. The whole family died, and he was the only one from the family who survived. And when I asked him about the bombings, he was pretty sure that this was done by Chechens. But at the same time, I read book and I know the other side of the story, and there are a lot of strange things happening before and after bombings.
The first bomb hits Moscow on September the 9th, the second on September the 13th. On that same day, the strange thing that happens is that the Speaker of the Russian Parliament, Gennady Zeleznov, announces that a third bomb has gone off in the city of Volgodonsk. It hasn't. A bomb does go off in Volgodonsk, but later.
He talked about a bomb at Volgodonsk in southern Russia that at that very moment hadn't got off.
And then the bomb did go off.
Yes, but 3 days later.
So the Speaker of the Russian Parliament predicted the bomb 3 days before it exploded. Is he an astrologist?
A fortune teller.
It's a joke, but not a funny one.
Yeah.
The strange thing that happens after the bombings in Moscow and Volgodonsk is there is another bomb. But this one doesn't go off at all. The bomb outrage that never was happens in the city of Ryazan, 200 clicks south of Moscow.
This is actually very strange. People were on high alert because of the bombs that had gone off in Moscow and elsewhere. And then people in Ryazan saw some strangers leave something in the basement of their block of flats.
So there was a wave of terror in September 99, and everybody in Russia was hyper anxious. And you'd have local committees of ordinary people, like Citizens Watch, looking out for their apartment buildings and making sure that everything was okay.
So, yeah, and one of these kind of searchings, like local citizen of Ryazan, the local resident, they found sacks with something suspicious inside.
The residents of the block of flats in Ryazan saw 3 people act suspiciously. Their car, a Lada, had fake cardboard number plates. A local resident, a medical student called Yulia, watched a man come out of the basement, check his watch, and then they left. The locals call the Ryazan cops who find a bomb. They evacuate the block of flats in the middle of the night and send in the local bomb squad. They defuse the bomb. A few months later, I went to Ryazan for our Channel 4 film, Dying for the President, and I asked one of the residents who the people were.
Were the strangers you saw Chechen?
Нет, они были русские.
They were Russians, the girl and both men.
Мужчины. Девушка.
The girl had blonde hair, cut short.
Такая короткая стрижка.
The local cops tracked the car with the dodgy number plates and nicked 2 men. The woman is gone, and they flash their ID cards. They're FSB, the secret police, and they walk. 2 days later, the new head of the secret police says it was all just an exercise. And the bomb? That was made of sugar.
One of my ex-colleagues, so on the newspaper I work for, he was one of those who found out about Ryazan sugar. This is what we call Ryazan sugar.
It was written on the sacks, sugar, saka.
It said sugar, yes, сахар.
Saka, which is actually the root word of saccharin, but it's sugar in Russian, saka. Was it sugar?
No, it wasn't sugar, it was explosive.
It was a military-grade explosive called hexagon.
Yes, hexagon in Russian.
Remember, Veronica, for perfectly understandable reasons, has got family back home in Russia, and she doesn't want her voice on this podcast. Her words are being spoken by Christina, who's not from Russia at all. She's from Ukraine. She's not from Kyiv, that's where she is now. She's originally from Mariupol, which is the town, a port city in the south, which has been hammered by the Russian army. And Christina, You've got a video.
Yeah, I've got a video of my flat that my mom sent me.
Dear God.
I don't know how to explain this feeling, just disgusting. I just hate them, so much. They just took everything that we have.
Let's go back to the Moscow apartment bombs in 1999. This is dark stuff. I check it out, with Professor Donald Rayfield, a student of all things Russian for 6 decades, more. Who did this?
KGB, or the FSB as it is now. There's absolutely no doubt about that. A criminal group in the Kremlin that who blew up Russia. All the evidence of witnesses is that it couldn't possibly be in Chechens. And then, of course, they were caught attempting to do the same thing in the town of Ryazan, and the local police, as often happens with secret services, the local plod comes along and says, "What are you doing?" and spoils it all. And they say, "Oh, it's just sugar, just for practice." And it wasn't sugar, it was high explosive.
It wasn't sugar. So the FSB cover story was, it was sugar. And this explosive expert said, no, it's hexagon, no question.
Yeah.
And that, and the fact that the FSB officers were caught in Ryazan means that it casts an enormous well of doubt on the first 2 Moscow apartment bombs. The problem is that this is used by Putin as a casus belli to launch the second Chechen war.
Yes, he wanted to destroy Chechnya by killing them or driving out of the country or demoralizing them, but they wanted to totally flatten the country, terrorize the population, and this was the excuse needed. It's as flagrant as Hitler dressing up convicts in Polish uniforms and blaming them for firing at the German army as an excuse to invade Poland. It's a pathetic.
Back in 2000, I got hold of a photograph of the detonator found by the bomb squad. And I got hold of a test by a chemical mass spectrometer. The so-called sugar was indeed the military-grade explosive, hexagon. Then a soldier came forward, Private Alexei Penyaev, who says he was guarding a military warehouse before the Ryazan sugar incident. And he and a mate helped themselves to the stuff in the sacks marked sugar for their tea, 1 lump or 2. But it tasted horrible, so they threw it away. Fearing that they'd been poisoned, they told their senior officer, and he had the sugar tested, and it was hexagon. Penyaev later denied the story at a press conference, staged, or perhaps stage-managed, by the FSB.
Were the apartment bombs the work of Chechen terrorists?
No.
There is powerful evidence that the very thing that galvanized Vladimir Putin's career in Russian politics, his fight back against Chechen bomb outrages, was in fact a black operation by the secret police. In his ghosted autobiography, First Person, Putin is challenged about this, and he denies it, replying, "Blowing up our own apartment buildings? That's really utter nonsense. It's totally insane. No one in the Russian special services would be capable of such a crime against his own people. The very supposition is amoral. It's nothing but part of the information war against Russia." September 1999, and the Moscow apartment bombs is the time, the way I see it, that Russia ceases to be a democracy. The cost and human suffering of the war in Chechnya is immense. In February 2000, I go undercover to Chechnya for my old paper, The Observer, and Channel 4's dispatches. At the border, I stumble across a woman, a refugee.
Никогда не будет! Подожди. Никогда не будет народ жить свободно! Одна воспитывала 2 детей. Спасибо Путину!
She's screaming, "Burnt alive! Thanks, Putin!" On the ground in 2 bags are the charred remains of her 2 sisters. In a hospital, I meet an 8-year-old girl. Let's call her Kamisa. Her face is burnt almost out of recognition. Here's a clip from our film for Dispatches, Dying for the President.
When we were going on the road. Two planes hit us in the car. My daddy, Mehmet, and Mummy were sitting in front. Rusik, me, Medina, Hava, and Louisa were sitting in the back. Daddy and Hava were still in the car. Rusik, me, Medina, and Louisa were thrown out into the mud.
I asked her whether the family's car had been flying a white flag.
It was tied on a wooden stick.
Kamisa lost her mother and father, 4 brothers and sisters and a cousin. By the way, the voice of Kamisa back then was read by my daughter Molly, who was also 8 at the time. Bombing a white flag convoy is a war crime. So is using vacuum bombs against civilians. They suck people's lungs inside out. So is torture on an industrial scale. I still have nightmares about the tortures. I saw damning evidence of all 3, torture, vacuum bombs, and bombing white flag convoys in Putin's war on Chechnya. And I came away struggling to understand how a president could let these crimes against humanity go unchecked. Surely, that's a sign of Vladimir Putin being a war criminal, a psychopath, a serial killer. 22 years on, torture, vacuum bombs, and attacking refugee convoys are back in the news in Ukraine. But back then, others read Putin differently.
That of a whole series of historical legacies that have to be overcome.
That's Tony Blair talking to Associated Press in 2000 about his newfound bestie, Vladimir Putin.
So I don't think it's surprising that he is and presents himself as a strong leader, as a patriotic leader for Russia.
So much for Putin's image at home. And abroad, George W. Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul and liked what he saw. I chew the fat with Professor Donald Rayfield about the West's love-in with Vladimir Putin when he was the new secret policeman on the block. What the West tried to believe in was a fairy story, that Putin was one of us, a Democrat, somebody who was a tough guy, but essentially who believed in the rule of law and a rules-based world, and he doesn't.
No, but he doesn't drink. And that to them after Yeltsin and Khrushchev, that the most frightening Soviet leaders were the ones that drank, because they could press a button at any time.
He drinks a little.
But not enough to be out of control.
Right.
Secondly, he's pretty rational. He calculates the risk and profit and loss of every action he undertakes. He works out. He's rather like Stalin in that sense. He's very, very good, with occasional mistakes, about calculating risk, and therefore pretty cautious in international adventures. When he rips off a bit of another country, he does it at a time when he's pretty sure there'll be no consequences, or none worth worrying about. So I suppose dealing with apparently rational psychopath is better than dealing with an irrational drunk. And the fact that he had everything under control meant there was going to be no more trouble in Russia, they felt. There wouldn't be territories trying to break away, there wouldn't be rioting, and Russian oil, gas, nickel, and whatever else they supply to the West would be mined and distributed without hitches. I think that was the West's calculation, that he may be a bastard, but my God, he was going to run things properly and we would be able to make a profit out of it.
But what if Tony Blair and co. made a big mistake? That Putin isn't a stable psychopath, but an unstable psychopath. What then? And the butcher's bill? Well, to begin with, that was paid by others. People like Kamisa from Chechnya. I asked Jenny Klochko a journalist, to try and find her for this podcast. It's not going to be easy.
You're fired.
And then, 21 years after I first saw Kamisa's horribly burnt face in hospital.
Алло, здравствуйте.
Алло.
Алло?
Здравствуйте, вы звонили у меня? Алло.
Да, конечно, звонила.
Now Kamisa is married with 2 girls and a third on the way.
But the sad thing is they don't have they don't have a grandfather or a grandma.
Да.
When you see Vladimir Putin, come to London, meet the Queen, talk to our prime ministers, what do you think?
I wonder if I really can say it. I don't know. Is someone going to listen to it?
You know what you think, but you don't want to say it.
Да.
I understand. People in Russia are afraid to talk. That's true, isn't it?
Да.
Yes, they are afraid. They're afraid to breathe.
Честно.
So you can draw a straight line through the Moscow apartment bombs, the Second Chechen War, and the war in Ukraine in 2022, and the bombing of Borodyanka. Here's Arthur Snell, who used to work in diplomatic and intelligence postings for the British Foreign Office. He's somewhere in the West Country. I'm in Kyiv.
Arthur, back in the day, what did you know? What did you hear about the Moscow apartment bombs of 1999? Was this, as the Kremlin said, a terrorist operation by Chechen extremists? Or what was it? What really happened?
At the time in the UK, this was, of course, pre-9/11, but certainly we were aware of the phenomenon of Islamist extremism, and everyone was well aware of the conflict in Chechnya. It seemed possible, it certainly was believable that this might be a terrorist campaign unfolding. But then when you started to dig into it, aspects of this story just didn't add up. So we start to think, hang on, is this a terrorist campaign or is this some crazy inside job? And ever since 1999, I think there's been a debate where people can't quite bring themselves to believe that even Putin's Russia, would they go that far? Would they have killed hundreds of their own people to justify a war against Chechnya, which is exactly what happened in the aftermath?
Having seen with my own eyes evidence of Russian war crimes in Borodyanka and Bucha, I now take the view Vladimir Putin has a complete disregard for the lives of others, and therefore that informs my judgment about the Moscow apartment bombs. To be fair to me, I started raising doubts about it in March 2000 because I investigated it.
It's important that the listeners remember that model of ultimate destruction of cities, what we've seen in Mariupol, is what we saw in Grozny. And so there's a straight line about how Putin's Kremlin wages war, and they've waged it in Grozny, they did it in Aleppo, and of course they're doing it now in Ukraine. So this series of bombings is arguably the original sin. It's the opening chapter of the Putin playbook. There's 2 really important questions here. 1, did the British state know about it? And 2, did they care? I think it's very likely that the British government knew and probably didn't want to know. And of course, something happened, a big thing happened in the world not long after, 9/11. So there was a time when the Russians were obsessed with Islamist terrorism, and then that obsession spread to Western countries. And this is not for a moment to suggest that Western countries were wrong to respond to 9/11, but ultimately we had an elision of interests. We saw Russia as an ally in the war on terror, and at the same time, Russia's growing economy was pumping money through the Western financial system, especially London.
Yes. So it is, it's the classic thing, is my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the problem is that this enemy, Vladimir Putin, is far more dangerous than the other enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. And, people have analyzed the way in which Western powers in particular overemphasize this struggle against Islamist extremism, against insurgencies, against non-state threats. And we seem to have forgotten that two large and heavily armed countries, nuclear armed countries, Russia and China, have been building up their military, have been becoming increasingly aggressive, have been breaking all kinds of taboos. And Russia has now launched the first major land war in Europe since the end of World War II. It is not to say that Islamist extremism wasn't a threat, but it didn't mean that we should have ignored that Russia was also a problem.
How many Ukrainians have died because we screwed up over the last 20 years?
Josh, that's a very, very tough question. Let's not forget that this war began in 2014. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced from their homes in eastern Ukraine. Crimea was lost to Ukraine. And that was just from 2014. And then this second wave, the war crimes, the genocidal behavior of the Russian military, we will be very sadly counting the dead for many months to come. You know, Mariupol, Kyiv, these are huge cities. We still don't know the scale of the destruction. People are still trying to come to terms with what's happened there. I think it requires us to be very honest. It's not enough just to say, well, we're supplying them anti-tank weapons. It's very good that we're doing that. I'm proud that we've done that. But we have to ask ourselves, have we made it difficult for the Russian elite, the kleptocratic elite, to live their lives in the way that they want to? And I think the answer is no, we haven't. And we need to look at ourselves and look at the structure of our own society in Britain that enables these sorts of people.
That's Arthur Snell. The common denominator between the Moscow apartment bombs, the wars in Chechnya, and now Ukraine is the master of the Kremlin showing a complete and utter disregard for human life. And at the start of all this, the West, and the British authorities in particular, not counting the dead. But there's so many more dead to come.
I do remember when the news arrived about Yuri Shikachikhin's death. I was the beginning journalist in the moment, and it was clear that we entered the new phase of the state terror.
Listen out for our next episode of Taking on Putin, the Killing Machine. That's next time. You've been listening to Taking on Putin, Episode 5, Let's Not Count the Dead. Taking on Putin is a podcast series written and reported by me, John Sweeney, for Black Dog Woof Woof Productions. It's produced by Chalk and Blade in London and sound recording by Syndicate Productions in Kyiv. For Chalk and Blade, the executive producer is Laura Sheeter, with other production by the team. It's mixed and sound designed by Alex Port-Felix, with original music by Thomas Hewitt-Jones. Thanks to Hard Cash Productions for the clips from Dying for the President, filmed by the late James Miller and produced by Carla Garapedian. And thanks for the clip from Associated Press of Tony Blair. I've launched a crowdfunder to help fund this podcast, Taking on Putin. There are lots of costs, lawyers checking things out, making sure that it gets to all the right platforms, making sure that the people that I'm working with, and I, am safe from legal and other threats. I'm not going to spell them out, but use your imagination. So if you can help me tell this story, please help me crowdfund it. And your search engine dial in crowdfunder Taking on Putin with me, John Sweeney. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming along for the ride. Take care, and love from Kyiv.